Okay, so the last thing we do after a session is write a SOAP note. So what is a SOAP note? SOAP is an acronym that stands for Subjective, Objective, Assessment, and Plan. The subjective section covers qualitative information about a session, like did the client arrive on time, who brought the client, was the client engaged in the session activities, and then if it's the beginning or end of a quarter, you might talk about a pre or post-treatment interview with the client and their parent or caregiver. Some supervisors like to see the pre and post-treatment interview information in the subjective section, while others prefer it to be included in the assessment section. This section is typically very short. Some supervisors even specify that it doesn't exceed 3 to 4 sentences. So here are some examples of subjective sections of SOAP notes. I'm using Jane Doe as my hypothetical client name for all the examples you're going to see. So you're going to see the initials JD on all the reports. In these two reports, you can see the heading of the SOAP as well as the subjective section. The heading covers information like the client's name, the clinician name, the clinical educator, who I refer to as your supervisor in this video, the date of the session, and the session number. One thing to keep in mind when writing SOAP notes is that the date is the date that the session happened on, not the date you're writing the report. So for the first SOAP here, we see that it was for the 17th session with Jane Doe that happened on March 10th. You can also see the typical length of a subjective section in this first SOAP, where you have about 2 sentences answering the questions I mentioned before. In the second SOAP note, the subjective section includes information from the pre-treatment interview, so it's a little bit longer. The objective section is where you report on the data you collected in the session. This is best done in a bullet point format and is just reporting the data you collected. You are not interpreting any of the data. Here are some examples of objective sections. You are welcome to pause the video to read these more closely, as I'm not going to be going over them in detail. What I'm showing you with these reports is that the format is something they all kind of share. They're all bullet point lists with the data collected. The objective sections either outline the date and the length of the section, as we see in the two on the right, or they list the session time and break down bullet points by date, as we see on the left. The report on the left is what we call a double SOAP, meaning it is one SOAP note that covers 2 sessions. In this scenario, dates are included with each bullet point instead of at the top of the section. The other thing I want to point out is that when hierarchies are referenced in the data, the hierarchy is included in the objective section. You can also see the variety of lengths that the objective section can be. The length of this section is largely going to be dependent on how focused the client is and how involved your activities are. So this is also an objective section, and I wanted to share this because it's a good example of what your objective section might look like if you do formal testing during a session. In this example, we did the process assessment of the learner, second edition, or the PAL 2 with Jane Doe. What stays the same is the first line of text under objective, that line of text that tells you what date the data was collected on and the length of the session. What changes is the way you outline the data. When you do formal testing, you include the name of the test along with the abbreviation, author, and the year it was published. Under the name of the test, you include a description of the test. Many tests have saved descriptions on the department Canvas site, so you don't have to come up with a description every time. If there isn't a description for a test there, you can also modify the descriptions on the publisher website or those in the test manual that outline the purpose of the test. Following the description, provide the numerical results of the assessment or test. In this case, these are presented in a table format. You do not have to provide all the data from the test. Select the information that is the most relevant and report that. What I mean by that is that you are reporting on the scaled scores, percentile ranks, determinations, or other computed scores. You should not be reporting raw scores because these are not going to be meaningful pieces of information when determining quarter goals or relaying information about the client's current skills. Focus on the big picture information here. You also want to include any information someone reading this report might need to interpret the scores. For example, in this sample, the bottom row on the table says the scaled score has a mean of 10 and a standard deviation of 3. The scaled scores range from 1 to 19. This gives the reader some context when they are trying to interpret the scaled scores that are included in the table. Below the table, there is a brief summary of results. The summary focuses on big picture results that we can pull from the results presented in the table. I think the biggest takeaway from for the objective section is that we're presenting data only, no interpretation. In the case of the PAL2 write-up, it's all just data, no interpretation, including the information in the summary of results. Save the interpretation for the next section. Which brings us to assessment. As I was saying, this is where you're interpreting the data you collected. You might use this space to touch on where the client is in relation to their quarter treatment goals, where they are in relation to the previous session, have they improved, gotten worse, or stayed the same, or talk about what factors may have impacted their performance. Here are some examples of assessment sections which you are welcome to pause and read on your own. I will be briefly talking about some examples of things you might see in an assessment section, but not going over these too thoroughly. That being said, I do want to point out that the assessment section in the top left does include a post-treatment interview summary, which some supervisors might like to include in the assessment section rather than the subjective section. Okay, so when I write an assessment section, I often pull up the previous SOAP to compare data. That way I can touch on whether the client showed improvement from one session to the next. If I notice marked improvement, I will comment on that and possibly mention some factors that may have contributed to that. For instance, if the client was more focused, if a parent mentioned that they were practicing skills at home, or if I was trying a new strategy, I would especially want to note if I was trying a new strategy because I would want to talk about how effective it was, and a good way to do that is present data that demonstrates improvement. If the client shows enough improvement that I'm thinking they should have to move to a different level of linguistic complexity, I would also want to address that in this section. For example, if I have a client working at the syllable level and demonstrating 80 to 90% accuracy, I might decide that the client is ready to start working at the word level. In the assessment section, I would mention their high level of accuracy at the syllable level and talk about increasing their linguistic complexity to further develop the client's skill and increase their ability to communicate effectively. If the client's scores drop from one session to the next, I would touch on what factors might have contributed to the decrease. Were they more distracted? Were they feeling sick? Were they tired? Were they not engaged or interested in the task? And I would want to address what changes I was going to make to counter these factors in the following session. Now, for some of these, like feeling sick or tired, you're not going to have control over it, and you're not going to write, "Hope the client feels better next time." I'm talking more about if the client's performance drops due to low engagement or interest in a task, or if you're working at a linguistic level that's too complex for your client. If you think one of those might be the cause of the drop in scores, you would want to address that and talk about changes you're going to make to fix it. If the scores stay relatively the same, you could talk about things you might try to improve performance, or you can talk about how you expect to see growth in X amount of time given X evidence. This could be as simple as saying, "This is a new skill for Jane Doe, and continued growth is expected given more exposure and instruction." Now, another thing you might have noticed in both of these assessment sections is that they both end with a similar statement, which I will highlight on the next slide. This statement, or some form of it, will be at the end of every assessment section. We include this because it explains why the client is in therapy and why they should continue to attend therapy sessions. This statement is also important for insurance purposes. What it says is that the client has deficits that impact their ability to function at a basic level, their ability to care for their health, safety, and navigate emergency situations, and that they should receive therapy to help them improve their ability to function at this level. The X here is where you would put the deficit or diagnosis that your client has. It may be articulation and phonology, it might be dyslexia, it may be expressive and receptive language, and then client will be replaced by your client's name. This statement almost always comes at the end of the assessment section, but will be determined by your supervisor's preference. After the assessment section comes the plan. The plan changes a lot based on your supervisor, but basically outlines what you're going to do in the next section or session. Here are two examples of different plan sections. The top example shows a more vague plan that essentially says, we recommend that the client continue to receive therapy, and here is what we have been working on and will continue to work on, with a bullet-pointed list of broad targets for intervention. This is different in the second plan section because, well, the first one has targets like regular past tense verbs. The second plan has more specific goals with a JD will create a topic sentence for an academic paper, given a story outline and level 4 clinician support per the established queuing hierarchy. Again, the specificity of your plan section is going to be determined in large part by your supervisor. Across all SOAP notes, the plan will be followed by signatures of the clinical supervisor and the graduate student clinician or clinicians. And that's the whole SOAP note. So some things to remember while you're writing SOAPs is that you want to always use initials in place of the client names and family member names. In all the examples I shared, I abbreviated Jane Doe with JD. This is a HIPAA thing, and you want to make sure that you do this to protect the client's privacy. Another safeguard that we have in accordance with HIPAA is that our clinic documents, like SOAPs, lesson plans, and anything with client information on it, are always password protected. Your supervisor is going to provide you with a password, and you will have a different password for each supervisor. Another thing to keep in mind when writing SOAPs is that your client can request to see these documents at any time. So you want to make sure you're being respectful when you are writing SOAPs. And as I have mentioned, your supervisor will likely have an opinion about the way you write and format your SOAPs. So it's a good idea to check in with them about their preferences at the beginning of the quarter. And that sums up writing SOAPs.